The year was 1926, and in the quiet town of Harrowsfield, the sweetest smell on Main Street came from a small, tidy bakery with lace curtains in the window. Every morning, the air was thick with the comforting aroma of butter crust baking, apples stewing in sugar, and cinnamon dust rising in the heat of the ovens. It was a place where children pressed their noses against the glass for a glimpse of golden pies cooling on the sill, and where tired farmers stopped for a slice before heading home. The woman behind it all was Mildred Lockhurst, a widow of about 48, known for her pale blue dresses, her neatly pinned hair, and her ever-present smile. To many, she was the embodiment of warmth and comfort, but on a rainy Sunday evening that summer, the sweetness soured. After a church social held in the town hall, neighbors staggered home in confusion, their bellies gripped with violent cramps. Some collapsed before they even reached their porches. By morning, 2 respected members of the congregation were dead, and several others hovered on the brink of death. Panic set in. Harrowsfield was a town where everyone knew everyone, where gossip spread faster than the weather, and where even the smallest scandal lingered for years. People demanded answers. Had something spoiled in the communal dishes? Was it a case of tainted flour? Or, more darkly, had someone meant to do harm? As the church bells tolled the following day, their sound was not of comfort but of dread. Townsfolk spoke in hushed voices outside the grocer and along the dusty road to the mill. A few pointed fingers, but most were too afraid to say aloud what their hearts already suspected. For one detail connected the sick and the dead. Each had eaten a generous slice of pie made by Mildred Lockhurst. The pies had been perfect as always. Golden crusts, latticed tops, their fillings sweetened just right. No one could forget the taste, nor the way Mildred had stood smiling as she served slice after slice, urging guests to take seconds. In the light of tragedy, that smile took on a different meaning. Yet despite the growing suspicion, no one dared accuse her openly. She was, after all, the grieving widow of Henry Lockhurst, a farmer who had died suddenly a few years prior. Since his passing, Mildred had been seen as a figure of sympathy, living quietly, baking to support herself, offering her creations at fairs, funerals, and socials. To accuse her of wrongdoing would be unthinkable, a cruelty piled atop her widowhood, and so the town remained in uneasy silence. But behind closed doors, whispers swelled. They remembered her insistence on preparing every dish alone, her guarded pantry, the way she never shared her recipes. Some recalled how her husband's death had been strangely swift, his symptoms oddly similar to those now felling others. These thoughts spread like an infection, until an undercurrent of fear rippled through Harrowsfield. On the streets, children were tugged away from her shop window. In kitchens, families refused to touch her baked goods, pushing them aside despite their golden glow. And still, Mildred Lockhurst stood behind her counter, greeting her customers with the same gentle smile, as though nothing at all were amiss. The air in town was heavy with contradiction. Could such a kind, unassuming woman truly be capable of murder? Or was she the victim of circumstance, her pies unfairly blamed for a tragic accident? No one dared ask her directly, and she never addressed the whispers. She simply continued baking, her shop bell ringing steadily as customers came and went. Some still loyal, others watching her with growing suspicion. That tension, that quiet dread settled like a shadow over Harrowsfield. Every pie placed on a table carried with it a question. Was it comfort or was it death? And so the story of Mildred Lockhurst began, not with a confession, not with a body found in the night, but with something far more chilling. It began with trust. Trust in a widow's kindness. Trust in the sweetness of her pies. Trust that would soon be broken in ways the town could never have imagined. Because behind the lace curtains of that little bakery, hidden beneath the scent of cinnamon and sugar, was a secret no one was yet ready to face. Was Mildred Lockhurst the town's most beloved baker? Or its most cunning killer? To understand the story of Mildred Lockhurst, we must step back into the world she inhabited. A world caught between tradition and modernity, where small-town values shaped every interaction, and where the tools of justice were still struggling to keep pace with the darker corners of human behavior. The year was 1926, but Harrowsfield might as well have been a decade behind the cities. Tucked between rolling farmland and a river that cut a silver path through the valley, it was a town of just a few thousand souls. Main Street was lined with brick storefronts, their painted signs advertising milliners, apothecaries, and general goods. The streets echoed with the clop of horses, though the hum of motor cars was beginning to creep in. Oil lamps still burned in some homes, though electricity was slowly spreading. The air smelled of tilled soil, wood smoke, and the sharp tang of coal soot from the town's small factory on the edge of town. Life in Harrowsfield moved at a steady rhythm, dictated by seasons, church bells, and market days. Families were bound together not only by kinship, but by necessity. Everyone knew their neighbors, their struggles, and their secrets, though some secrets, as Mildred Lockhurst would prove, could be hidden in plain sight. Mildred herself was a figure both ordinary and remarkable. Born Mildred Parker in 1878, she grew up the daughter of a blacksmith. Her childhood was marked by long hours of work, the clang of iron against anvil ringing through her youth. Neighbors recalled her as quiet, thoughtful, a girl who preferred the company of books and her mother's herb garden to the chatter of her peers. She learned early the uses of plants, how peppermint eased the stomach, how willow bark soothed fevers, and how foxglove, if mishandled, could stop a heart. It was knowledge both practical and dangerous, though no one at the time thought much of it. At 20, she married Henry Lockhurst, a farmer 10 years her senior. By all outward accounts, theirs was a steady, if unremarkable, marriage. They worked side by side on the farm, attended Sunday service, and were seen at every fair and market. They never had children, though whispers suggested that Mildred had suffered miscarriages, a sorrow she rarely spoke of. Those who knew her then described her as devoted, if somewhat reserved. Her affections expressed not through words, but through the careful preparation of meals and the keeping of an immaculate home. Henry's death in 1922 changed everything. He was found slumped in his chair one evening after supper, his face pale, his breathing labored. The doctor attributed it to heart failure, common enough in men who labored hard in the fields. No one questioned it further. Mildred, now a widow in her mid-40s, dressed in mourning black for a full year as was custom. But when she emerged from her grief, she did so not with tears but with pies. Baking had long been her talent, one she had displayed at county fairs, where her apple pie had claimed ribbons. After Henry's passing, it became her livelihood. She opened a modest bakery at the corner of Main and Willow Street, its windows adorned with lace curtains and the daily special chalked on a board outside. Locals flocked to her shop. The pies were flaky, rich, and always perfectly spiced. They tasted of comfort, of home, and perhaps most importantly of trust. And trust was something Mildred cultivated carefully. She donated pies to funerals, baked them for church fundraisers, and even delivered them personally to the sick. To most, she was a symbol of resilience, a woman who had endured loss and found purpose in her craft. Yet beneath this portrait of kindness lay subtler shades. Some neighbors recalled a sharpness in her tone when crossed, a coldness in her eyes when challenged. A few spoke of her habit of keeping to herself, rarely inviting others into her home or kitchen. There were stories, too, of cats disappearing near her property, though such things were often dismissed as the work of foxes or strays. In hindsight, these fragments seem like warnings, but at the time, they blended seamlessly into the fabric of small-town life. Mildred Lockhurst was not seen as dangerous. She was seen as dependable, the sort of woman who could be trusted with your children, your meals, your very well-being. It was this reputation that allowed her pies to grace so many tables without question, and this very trust that shielded her from suspicion when tragedy struck. For in Harrowsfield, hospitality was not merely kindness, it was identity. And who could imagine that the smiling widow at the bakery counter, her hands dusted with flour, might use that very identity as the perfect disguise? The setting was ready. The stage was set. All that remained was for the pattern of death to unfold, and for the town to realize that their sweetest comfort might also be their deadliest curse. The first deaths at the church social might have been dismissed as tragic coincidence. Foodborne illness was not uncommon in the 1920s. Without refrigeration in every home, meat spoiled quickly, milk soured, and dishes left too long on a table could easily make someone ill. But what unsettled the townsfolk of Harrowsfield was the severity of the sickness. These were not the usual stomach cramps or fevers that passed after a day. The victims of that summer's social withered in hours, their bodies racked with pain, their faces twisted in agony. Doctors struggled to explain it. Some whispered about influenza, others about tainted flour or sugar brought in from outside. But then the rumors began to settle around a single detail. Each of the stricken had eaten Mildred Lockhurst's pies. The evidence was circumstantial, but the memory of her urging seconds, her gentle insistence that everyone try just one more slice, lingered with an eerie weight. Weeks passed, and life in Harrowsfield began to regain its rhythm. The funerals ended, the grief softened, and the town returned to its work. Mildred's bakery continued to open each morning. Some customers hesitated, but others, too loyal or too trusting, kept buying. And then the deaths began again. The next was Mr. Albert Givens, a banker with slicked hair and sharp suits who had recently denied Mildred an extension on a small loan. He was found slumped over his desk, his skin pale, his breath shallow. His clerk recalled that just the day before, he had enjoyed a slice of pie that Mildred herself had delivered, wrapped neatly in brown paper with a string bow. His death was marked down as a heart seizure. Then came Mrs. Ellen Cartwright, a neighbor who had feuded with Mildred over a boundary fence. She had accused Mildred of creeping her hens too far onto her land, and the argument had been heated. Weeks later, Ellen was dead after a mysterious bout of illness. Once again, pie had been part of her last meal. The pattern was there, but at the time no one dared call it what it was. Poisoning was a word that belonged in novels or whispered legends, not in the respectable homes of Harrowsfield, and certainly not in connection with Mildred Lockhurst, the woman who still smiled at every passerby and donated pies to every church supper. But the tally grew. A young seamstress named Clara, rumored to be courting a man Mildred had shown an interest in, died suddenly after visiting the bakery. A traveling salesman who had argued with Mildred over his bill fell ill the day after sharing one of her meat pies. Each death could be explained away as bad luck, poor health, or accident. Yet together, they painted a darker story. The method, though invisible to her neighbors, was simple. Arsenic, commonly available in rat poisons and tonics, was Mildred's weapon of choice. Tasteless, odorless, and easy to conceal in flour or sugar, it was the poisoner's perfect tool. In small doses, it mimicked ordinary illnesses, nausea, weakness, stomach cramps. In larger amounts, it was fatal. To the untrained eye, it looked like fate had chosen its victim. To Mildred, it was control served up in a pie crust. She seemed to take no pause between the deaths. In fact, she often leaned into her role as the grieving supporter. When Ellen Cartwright was buried, Mildred baked pies for the family's morning table. When young Clara's funeral was held, Mildred offered free pastries for the guests. It was as if she wrapped herself deeper into the fabric of the community with every tragedy, positioning herself not as a cause of grief but as its comforter. And so, her reputation endured even as bodies quietly fell. The town's suspicion remained muted, hovering just out of reach, never daring to accuse. Yet in kitchens and parlors, when the doors were closed and the lamps dimmed, people whispered. "The widow's pies," they began to call them in half-joking tones, voices low enough that no one outside could hear. Perhaps the most chilling detail came in hindsight, when neighbors recalled Henry Lockhurst's death 4 years earlier. His sudden illness, his gasping breaths, the swiftness with which he faded, all mirrored the symptoms now appearing in others. Could it be that Mildred's first victim had been her own husband? That the pies she now sold were born from a darker experiment carried out in her own home? At the time, no one dared suggest it openly, but the questions lingered in every shadow. How many deaths were truly accidents, and how many were Mildred's careful design? The crimes of the widow baker were not loud or bloody. They left no knife wounds, no gunfire in the night. They were quiet, almost invisible, unfolding in kitchens, dining rooms, and parlors where families gathered in trust. Her weapon was not force, but hospitality. Her disguise was not a mask, but a smile. And as more and more of Harrowsfield fell ill, the town began to realize, though slowly, too slowly, that their sweetest comfort might also be their deadliest danger. For months, the deaths in Harrowsfield were spoken of in lowered voices, explained away with shrugs or attributed to fate. To many, it was easier to believe in bad luck than in the possibility of deliberate malice. But behind the closed doors of the town's modest hospital, one young doctor was not convinced. Dr. Samuel Whitaker was fresh from his medical training in Boston, having returned to his hometown to practice. He had a keen eye, a sharper curiosity, and perhaps most importantly, he had not yet grown accustomed to dismissing unusual cases as chance. When Albert Givens, the banker, had died suddenly, Whitaker had examined him and found the symptoms troubling. When Ellen Cartwright followed, and then young Clara, the pattern was too clear to ignore. Nausea, convulsions, tingling in the extremities. Whitaker had seen such signs before, not in patients but in textbooks. They were the calling cards of arsenic poisoning. The difficulty lay in proving it. In the 1920s, toxicology was still a fledgling science, and in small-town Harrowsfield, resources were scarce. There were no sophisticated laboratories, no advanced testing equipment. But Whitaker was determined. He persuaded the grieving family of Clara to allow an examination. The process was slow and painstaking, but when he finally tested tissue samples, his suspicions were confirmed. Arsenic, lethal amounts. It was a revelation that sent a chill through him. Someone in Harrowsfield was poisoning their neighbors and doing so with precision, and while he could not yet name her, he knew who stood at the center of every death. Mildred Lockhurst. Word of his findings spread cautiously. The local sheriff, George Tillman, was a practical man, skeptical of theories that might tear the town apart. But Whitaker was insistent. "This is no accident," he argued. "These people are being murdered." The sheriff, with little choice, began an inquiry. Quietly, he visited homes, asking after meals eaten, food shared, and gifts received. Again and again, one detail recurred: pies from Mildred. The idea that the kindly widow could be responsible was met with disbelief by many. "Mildred?" one woman exclaimed. "She nursed me when I was sick, sent pies when my mother died. She wouldn't harm a soul." Others, however, shifted uneasily, recalling small grudges, sharp remarks, and the strange insistence that no one but Mildred handle her ingredients. Detectives were brought in from the county seat. They searched her bakery and home. There, tucked away in her pantry, they found several packets of rat poison, arsenic-based, common enough, but in far greater quantities than any home might reasonably need. Pie crust remnants tested positive for traces of the same substance. The evidence was damning, but still circumstantial. Mildred denied everything, her calm demeanor unnerving even to those questioning her. She insisted the arsenic was for pests around the bakery, nothing more. A woman alone must protect her stock, she explained. Yet the mountain of coincidences became impossible to ignore. As investigators pressed further, testimonies from townsfolk revealed a web of grievances Mildred had carried. The banker who had denied her, the neighbor who had quarreled, the young woman who had courted a man she fancied, all had crossed her in some way. And all were now dead. The sheriff acted before more lives could be lost. On a gray morning in November, he led his men to the bakery. The bell above the door jingled as they entered. Behind the counter stood Mildred, her apron dusted with flour, her hands shaping a pie crust with methodical care. She looked up, surprised but not alarmed. As the sheriff read the warrant, customers on the street watched in stunned silence as Mildred Lockhurst, the widow once seen as a symbol of comfort, was escorted outside in handcuffs. The sight of her pale face beneath her baking bonnet was one that burned into the town's memory. Some gasped, some wept. Others turned away, muttering that they had always suspected. But for all, it was a moment of reckoning. The mask of hospitality had slipped, and what lay beneath was darker than anyone had dared to name. For Dr. Whitaker, the arrest was vindication, proof that science and persistence could unmask even the most carefully hidden crimes. For the people of Harrowsfield, it was the shattering of trust. The widow who had fed their families, who had comforted their dead, who had smiled as she handed them warm slices of pie, was now accused of being their killer. The town would never look at her pies the same way again. The arrest of Mildred Lockhurst stunned Harrowsfield, but the shock was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the small farming town became the center of a spectacle. Journalists poured in from nearby cities, their notebooks eager for every whispered detail. The headlines were merciless. "Widow's Pies of Death" screamed across front pages. Others labeled her the Angel of the Oven, or the Widow of Poison. For a place unaccustomed to scandal, Harrowsfield suddenly found itself under a magnifying glass. Its name carried far beyond its valley. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was suffocating. Farmers in work clothes and their wives in Sunday best filled the wooden benches. Children, though shooed away, often lingered at the windows, peering in for glimpses of the woman who had once given them sweets and now stood accused of murder. The air smelled faintly of ink and paper from the reporters, of sweat from the crowd pressed too tightly together. Mildred herself remained composed throughout the proceedings. She entered each day in simple dresses, her hair pinned neatly, her hands folded as if in prayer. When the charges were read aloud, multiple counts of murder by arsenic poisoning, she did not flinch. When witnesses testified, describing her gifts of pies to the deceased and recalling arguments she had held with her victims, she sat still, her expression unreadable. The prosecution painted her as deliberate and calculating, a woman who weaponized hospitality itself. They held up the evidence. The packets of arsenic found in her pantry, the toxicology results linking the deaths, the suspiciously similar symptoms that echoed through each case. They spoke of patterns, of motives both petty and profound, financial grievances, personal grudges, jealousies hidden beneath layers of pastry crust. The defense countered with a different image. They argued that Mildred was a lonely widow, misunderstood and unfairly maligned. The arsenic, they claimed, was for rats in her cellar. The deaths, tragic as they were, could not be laid so squarely at her feet. They reminded the jury of her generosity, of the pies donated to the grieving, of the woman who had stood by her neighbors in their darkest hours. But the tide of suspicion was too strong. Dr. Whitaker testified with quiet authority, explaining the science behind arsenic poisoning and detailing his findings. His words carried weight. The jury leaned in as he described symptoms that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Outside the courthouse, the town divided. Some clung to disbelief, convinced that Mildred was being sacrificed to explain tragedies beyond anyone's control. Others whispered that justice was long overdue, that the truth of her cruelty had been hiding in plain sight. When the verdict came, it was swift. Guilty on multiple counts of murder, the judge, his voice grave, sentenced Mildred to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In that hushed moment, the courtroom seemed to breathe as one. Some gasped, some prayed silently, and a few even wept. Not in sympathy, but in horror at what had been revealed about someone they had trusted so deeply. Mildred herself showed no outward emotion. She stood, accepted the sentence, and walked calmly with her guards. It was said that her last words to the court were soft, almost inaudible. They asked for pie. I only gave them what they wanted. Her imprisonment marked the end of an era for Harrowsfield. The bakery closed, its windows shuttered, its sign taken down. The lace curtains, once a symbol of comfort, yellowed in gathered dust. For decades, children passing by would point at the empty storefront and whisper stories of the widow who killed with kindness. The legacy of Mildred Lockhurst became both legend and cautionary tale. Parents warned their children not to accept food too easily, not to trust kindness without question. The phrase Lockhurst pie lingered in local speech, a grim shorthand for something that seemed sweet but carried hidden danger. Historians and crime writers would later look back on the case as a rare example of small-town America, confronting a serial poisoner, a crime more often associated with Gothic novels than with the heartland. Yet the tragedy was real, the graves filled, the lives ended, and for those who lived through it, the scars were not so easily erased. Even now, nearly a century later, one lesson remains chillingly clear. Evil does not always announce itself with violence or rage. Sometimes it comes wrapped in pastry crust, dusted with sugar and offered with a smile. Because in Harrowsfield, the sweetest comfort of all, the warmth of a neighbor's pie, had proven to be its deadliest curse.